talking about something extremely fundamental to Merleau-Ponty's thought: temporality. Time is the sense of life, and sense is the direction of a stream of water, the sense or meaning of a phrase, even the sense or the woven structure of a fabric, and the sense or feeling, sensation of an odor. Not only is time the sense, meaning, directionality, woven structure, the orientation of life, but life itself is the temporalization of existence. And consciousness is an intertemporalized existence in which experience, as embodied in the world, is directional, oriented, meaningful, and making sense. Merleau-Ponty's discussions of temporality at the end of Phenomenology of perception are anticipated by many descriptions and insights that come prior to it. He tells us throughout the Phenomenology that his descriptions will need to be further verified and completed by incorporating his descriptions of temporality, which come at the end. So while it's a slightly odd choice for us to begin here with what comes at the end of the Phenomenology of perception, it also makes sense because it's through the phenomenon of temporality that all other lived phenomenon are understood and verified. And it is the structure of temporality which in fact structures all of our descriptions whatsoever of being in the world, of spatiality, of the lived body, of language. All of those will be rooted in the temporalization of consciousness. We usually think of temporality and time as a kind of receptacle. It's something in which events happen, something that receives the world and allows us to measure one event as outside of another event. These are practical, conceptual ways of understanding time that help us get around in the world, but they do not have any ontological or phenomenological import. There's a primordial temporalization temporality is a way of unifying, is a way of forming a whole or a gestalt. In chaos theory and complexity theory and systems theory, the idea of self-organizing systems involve the irreversibility of time. The natural world is composed of movements, but not random, meaningless, chaotic movements, but movements akin to gesture and behavior. A convergence of movements into a whole that is self-organizing and self-perpetuating, and has within itself a kind of norm or standard by which its movements are perpetuated and sustained. A gestalt temporality, a temporal whole, always remains incomplete so long as it has not been verified through the phenomenological descriptions of the temporality of gestalts or the gestalts of temporality. As we'll see, it's impossible to conceive of gestalts as atemporal, and it's impossible to conceive of temporality as not a gestalt. One of the really beautiful things about Merleau-Ponty's descriptions of temporality as a gestalt is that he uses this aesthetic metaphor through music. And what that gets at is this kind of irreducible dimension of perception involved in all gestalts, the primacy of perception, as it's often called. A gestalt of every kind is always essentially perceptual, and thus also involves sense-making, feeling, meaning, directionality of flow, and the kind of woven structure of it. For Merleau-Ponty, temporality, gestalt, and sense are the most fundamental aspects of existence. His ontology is often called a gestalt ontology, or an ontology of expression, which gets at this idea of sense. And we could also say there's an ontology of time there, that temporality is the most fundamental level of being for Merleau-Ponty. So all of these three aspects of Merleau-Ponty's ontology need to be elucidated, but they also must be elucidated together as having this kind of equiprimordiality, to use a phenomenological term. They are equally primordial in being. So by starting at the end, by seeking to understand the whole as that which makes sense of all of Merleau-Ponty's descriptions, that whole is the temporality of gestalt in the temporalized event of sense-making. We are actually starting with what is most essential to nature and consciousness. The natural world, our lived body, our habits, and our consciousness are all temporal gestalts. Starting with this, we have already dissolved the gulf between nature and consciousness. And every possible description we can give of either nature or consciousness will always involve the embodied temporalization of sense as a melodic gestalt. Some of the connections between music and phenomenology are a bit more obvious. Music is something that we learn. It's a kind of habit. Habits are things that evolve in time and that we gradually get through practicing daily. And very closely related to habit for Merleau-Ponty is the idea of style. Style is basically a habituated way of acting, a way of carrying oneself that carries a significance and carries a kind of expressive, aesthetic dimension to it. So a style is something that we become habituated to, and from habit to style, we move one step further to what Merleau-Ponty calls transition synthesis. And transition synthesis names the fluctuation, the transformation from one gestalt to another. And this is going to be closely related to the idea of modulation. When we move from one key to another key, we modulate the norm by which the notes are organized. There's a kind of temporality to that shift of gestalt that is fundamental for all temporality for Merleau-Ponty. The transformation of consciousness from one sense-making system to another sense-making system is exactly what Merleau-Ponty means by transition synthesis. In the same way that I can transition from my perspective here and now to over there, and then I'll gain an entirely new perspective. Although those perspectives are still implied within one another, they are new perspectives. So in time, when I move from now to a later now, I don't simply move to a different place on a series of before and afters, but I gain an entire new perspective from which I view time. And those prior moments, those prior perspectives, are altered or modified by my new perspective. Music always has a temporal profile. It's not something that ever happens at an instant. It's something that unfolds dynamically over a duration. And even a single note on a piano or on a trumpet opens and is sustained through slight fluctuations and across a duration of time, and when it ceases, it decays gradually. It doesn't end all at once. There is a kind of temporal profile to it. It falls back into the cosmos from whence it came. A single tone on the piano evolves through a sort of life of its own. It has overtones which open up and seem to move around and settle back as it decays. Let's take a listen. We need to distinguish between two senses of time. For Merleau-Ponty, taking up the Kantian tradition, and Descartes, we have to distinguish between thetic time, the time of consciousness and concepts, and lived time, the time of our embodied movement in the world, of our gestures, and this kind of gestalt melodic temporality of time as we live it. We can think of time as a container of events where each event has its own specific place. And in this sense, time becomes space. Time is schematized, is outlined, and quantified in the exact same way that space is. We have time as points on a line where some are before and some are after, and we move across the line, and each time we move, we enter a new moment of time. That would be considered thetic time. Time as a construction of our consciousness. Our consciousness, in this sense, is a kind of temporalizing synthesizer. It's what puts time together. It synthesizes time. It constitutes time. And if consciousness is something which puts time together and synthesizes time, then consciousness is necessarily outside of time. And consciousness becomes an eternally unchanging consciousness that constitutes the flow of our lived experience of time. In this sense, time is totally dominated by consciousness because consciousness is what codifies time into its quantifiable and followable relationships. But time, lived time, according to Merleau-Ponty and according to our phenomenal experience, cannot be dominated by consciousness. Our consciousness cannot be completed. Our consciousness of time is never complete. It's something unfolding. It's something unraveling and developing. We still have a future, and our past is on the horizon of our passing present. We are not looking at time as if it was in a spatial container where every moment is next to one another. We don't live time in that way at all. Time cannot be fully constituted, and it cannot be treated as merely a result. Now, clearly, some aspects of time involve completeness, involve result. The past moments of what I just said a few moments ago, they are fully constituted. They are a result. But time is not simply what is made, it's a process in the making. So temporality can never be reduced to this single mode of its appearance. It appears to us as fully made, as something constituted, but that's only one of its aspects. And we should not define time in terms of that, and we in fact cannot define time in terms of that. Merleau-Ponty a few times refers to this idea of an eternity within time. How time appears to us to imply and to institute a certain eternality, eternal nature to it. He talks about an eternity of life, and this line he gets from Bergson. Bergson wants to disarticulate these two aspects of time, time as fully made and time in the making. Time in the making is what he means by an eternity of life. The continual becoming that never stops, the opening up and diverging of the present from the past. The present is becoming different than the past. It's becoming something new. And this eternity of life would be eternal present passing into novelty. And he wants to say that if we find eternity within our lived experience of time and our lived experience of temporalization, it's going to be an eternity at the core of our experience of time. And at the core is really important because the way that Kant understands consciousness as a kind of eternal present that constitutes time, a consciousness that is never in time, but that constitutes time, that would not be at the core of our experience of time. That would be at the periphery of our experience of time. Kant would say at the periphery, we have our transcendental ego, which puts everything together. And Bergson wants to say, Merleau-Ponty wants to say that at the core of our experience of time is where a sense of the eternal arises. So we'll get to that later. But what's key to this lived sense of time is that it's always within a certain milieu, it's always within a certain horizon that we experience time. And the horizon, again, is something that is distant, that adds a depth, that is something that cannot be fully grasped by consciousness, something that our consciousness cannot turn into an object and grasp in all of its nook and crannies, something that cannot be dominated by consciousness. So time is going to be exactly like that. It's like a background. It's like a gestalt that has some parts brought into the foreground at the expense of other parts being put into the background. Every moment of time has a certain perspective and cannot completely gather all of time up into a sum, into a totality, and grasp it as a static object. There are horizons of time which evade, escape, exceed the passing present. Speaking of the horizons of time, Merleau-Ponty says, I do not represent to myself my day. Rather, my day weighs upon me with all of its weight. It's still here. I do not recall any particular detail, but I have the immanent power of doing so. I have it still in hand. Similarly, I do not think about the evening that is about to arrive, nor what it will entail, and yet it is there, just like the back of the house whose front I am looking at, or the background beneath the figure. The key here is that the future and the past are not simply projections of our consciousness. They're not imagined realities or concepts. They have a being of their own. They have a reality of our own that is irreducible to our consciousness of them. They are not reducible to the present of consciousness or our present imagining of them. There is a being of the past. Merleau-Ponty's idea of the horizons of lived time is drawn from a famous description and diagram given by Edmund Husserl in his book Internal Time Consciousness. The diagram attempts to show how every moment of passing time, the past runs off. We can think about this using the example of a melody. With each note, the past note, as it's heard, runs off into the past. So we can think about these notes in this way. At each one of these notes as it sounds, the prior note is also heard along with it. And so this moment has the prior moment running off into it. By the time we hear the third note, we hear that third note as if it was played in the context of the prior two notes. So we hear, on the third note, we hear. Now we don't actually hear it, but it's the context and the background by which we hear the third note. We still hear that context of the prior two notes in the third note. And the notes, as they're being played, in some way anticipate the notes that are coming next. As soon as we hear, then are protended. We protend those as coming notes, as what's going to come next. We anticipate them. Each note becomes intertemporally connected with the other notes as our immediate retention of them holds what we have just heard and anticipates what we're going to hear next. I've chosen this example because this fourth note here actually modulates the key slightly. So we hear these first three notes as kind of playing in A minor. But when this fourth note comes in, it sort of shifts that into this F major 7. And that chord has a much different sound. Its reference point is a different reference point from this chord. It's much softer, much more melancholy, much less severe than the minor chord. So what we see here is not only how our intertemporal structure has this interconnecting network of intentionalities within it, but it also shows us how a modulation will retrospectively change our understanding of the prior moments. And this is what Husserl calls modifications. Prior moments undergo a modification based on later moments. So we modify our interpretation of those earlier notes based on the new establishment of the tonic center. And that tonic center is making us hear this major 7 chord instead of that minor chord. When we reach this moment, it's as if we look back on that first moment in a new way. And it's from the perspective of this moment that we now interpret that prior moment and all of the other prior moments. And from this new gestalt that is formed when the modulation to the new key center occurs, a whole new set of anticipations will arise. And that is represented by the running off lines going into the horizon of the future. It shifts the horizon by which we understand the current moment. we are now listening for something in this type of style and scale. When just a moment ago we were hearing this, which would be something more grave. But then the modulation comes and we hear this major 7 chord. So these prior anticipations derived from the retentions of the prior notes will shift when the modulation occurs here and we have new anticipations on the opposite side. So as Husserl says and Merleau-Ponty repeats, for every moment that arrives, the previous moment suffers a modification. These modifications are due in part to the horizontal structure of time, the fact that every moment has its own unique horizon. Each trailing line falling off behind is what Husserl calls running off. So the present moment, as it's passing away, is running off into the past. And the prior moments that came before it are running off as well. Quoting Husserl from his book Internal Time Consciousness, if we go along the concrete continuity, we advance in continuous modifications. And in this process, the mode of running off is constantly modified, i.e., along the continuity of running off of the temporal points concerned. Since a new now is always presenting itself, each now is changed into a past, and thus the entire continuity of the running off of the pasts of the preceding points moves uniformly downward into the depths of the past. What this means is that at each moment, the present is passing away into the past, and by the accumulation of the past continuously drifts off from us, being mediated by every other moment interceding it and the present moment. And in each moment, the past can be remodified again. So the note that is 3 notes away from the 4th note can become reinterpreted based on that 4th note, not simply by being mediated by the 2nd and 3rd notes, but by the 4th note further on top of those. So that provides for this layering effect of time as the past sinks down below the passing of the present. Merleau-Ponty gets at this same idea in the Phenomenology of Perception. He says, in order to keep hold of the past moment, I must reach across a thin layer of time. It is still clearly the same one, and I have the power of meeting up with it as such as it just was, and I am not cut off from it. But then again, it would not be past if nothing had changed. It begins to appear perspectively against or to project itself upon the present, whereas just a moment ago, it in fact was my present. When a third moment takes place, the second one suffers a new modification. Having been a retention, it now becomes the retention of a retention, and the layer of time between it and myself becomes thicker. So when we think about the intertemporality of time, we're not thinking of time as just moving from one moment to another on a single line, but instead, as moment A becomes moment B, so a second moment in time, A also becomes A prime. And what that means is that simultaneously with becoming different than itself, what has become now at moment B retains A, but it's not simply A, it's A prime. It's A from the perspective of B. And then when it moves to a third moment, C, it also has moved to B prime, and prime has moved to A double prime. So from moment C, we have a piling up of the past, moving from one moment to the next, but also creating more potential perspectives on those past moments at every moment. Each moment is a unique harmonic in a single system of overtones, in the same way that a gesture envelops all of the muscular contractions that are necessary to produce it. There's a kind of organic gestalt unity going on here. We have the unity of a changing duration, moving from one unique moment to a different unique moment. The unity of the different moments is nothing like a sum or a totality. We don't gather all of these together and look at them all at once. It's much more fluid than that, and breaking it up into individual moments is always very artificial. And yet, despite the artificiality of breaking time up into different moments, it's still the case that time is interwoven in this way, that the moments of time are multiplied in the perspectives that we can take on them, and that every single moment is a modulation where we gain a new perspective on all of the other moments. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that we don't get at the past as a kind of concept or as an idea, but we get at the past in its hexaity. And hexaity is a really important word from Merleau-Ponty. It means thisness. It is the unique this and only this of a moment in time or of a person's unique style. Hexaity gets at that utterly concrete, unique aspect of reality. So when we retain the past, it's not as if we retain the prior moment as a kind of image or as a representation or anything like that. It's not something that our mind has to produce. We retain the past in its hexaity, in its uniqueness, not as a kind of general, abstraction or anything like that. This probably won't all make sense right now. Again, we are outlining certain conceptual contours which we'll have to progress through and actually have to become habituated to new ways of thinking. And that will most likely take many attempts to achieve. Like all habits and skills, we must fail many times in the early stages. As the learning process evolves, these failures, as they are mistakenly named and stigmatized, are actually the productive and vital activities of all healthy development. We have to put the cart before the horse, in a way. We have to start with the whole. We have to start with the integral view, which at this stage is basically symbolic. It's a kind of loose, rough sketch, and provisionally it will remain somewhat abstract. We then must begin again and look at each of the parts in detail in the series of modules moving forward, with the goal of later grasping them in their totality, in their integral, as an integral view. So this lesson is really a prelude to what will come next, and we will reprise all of these themes and these transitions in modules 3 through 7. Music is experienced in duration. There's a kind of continuity to the sonic fluctuations, and these sonic fluctuations are organized and harmonized and metrically organized to become something more than the sum of the parts. The melodic and rhythmic unity and continuity of the melody and of music are embodied gestalts of sense-making. For Merleau-Ponty, gestalts are most fundamentally found in the lived, embodied activity of our bodies, our gesture, our motricity, our behavior. Gesture is a kind of kinetic melody. It's a kind of melody composed of bodily gestures. The continuity of our motricity is a kind of melodic whole. It's not a juxtaposition of parts which are pre-existing and then are synthesized and assembled together abstractly. A gestalt is a very particular type of whole. It's a whole that precedes the parts, and yet is present in all of the parts, but not in such a way as to ever exist as a sum or a totality present to consciousness in an instant. We never grasp the whole at once, and yet we somehow divine that there is a whole in each of the parts. We know the whole is in each of the parts because the parts are always already in the whole, but we never grasp the whole as a totality in any one of its single parts. These gestalts unfold through time. This is exactly the way a melody is heard and understood. We don't grasp it in an explicit act of arthetic consciousness. It's something that we feel and something that we follow from moment to moment as it unfolds. Some melodies are quickly understood and we easily adopt and recognize the specific style that it has. Classical, enjoyable, lovable melodies often have a profound sense of particularity to them. Their expressivity and their emotion is unique to that gestalt of sounds. Melodies can be both complex and followable. We quickly adapt to a piece of music and we participate in it and adopt its attitude. Music is always influenced by certain historical traditions and musical cultures, but music is also inventive and expressive. It's surpassing prior influences and styles. A single piece of music can even exhibit an evolutionary surpassing within its own structure. This is what Arnold Schoenberg calls developing variations, when the themes and motifs evolve within the piece itself. This doesn't mean that the melody line is played incompletely in various deficient versions of that melody that gradually build into the complete form. Instead, it involves a becoming that was not sketched or represented prior to its unfolding, that was not simply fulfilling some intention that was mentioned at the beginning melodically. It's not something that can be understood in the prior context. It's a transition from one perspective, one sonic perspective, we might say, to another. This becoming is a horizon of perspectives, and the movement from one perspective to another is what Merleau-Ponty calls transition synthesis. Transition synthesis involves the transformation of meaning from one context to another, whereby a new meaning or sense is instituted, and it opens up a new field of meaning and orientation, and this is what Merleau-Ponty calls modulation. The development of a musical theme can evolve to have a completely new qualitative profile, a new style of its own, while having come to this style in a continuous process, a continuous duration, a continuous temporality of evolving from one to the other. We transition from one sense-making field, one context, one key, perhaps, one rhythm, to another, and this move makes a difference and involves this kind of irreversible transformation that institutes the new meaning, the new orientation, and the new context. When we reflect on our lived body, on our cogito, on our consciousness, we actually transform the way that existence is. We institute a new sense. When we reflect on our consciousness, we actually change the way we think. And these changes bring about new meaningful encounters in our lives and new ways of making sense. When we come to experience a new genre of music and we come to appreciate its particular style, this changes the way we see the world to some degree. It opens up new paths of interpretation and allows things to peer with new possibilities. And every style we come to understand improves our aesthetic sensibility, our aesthetic sensitivity, the depth of the sentiments that we feel in an aesthetic experience. The more we come to integrate different styles, the more creative we become, and the more sense we can institute in new sense-making structures. Merleau-Ponty actually invents a distinct style of philosophizing. His style is his approach to questioning and investigating phenomenon, and it's a mix of Kant, Mandelbrot, Ravissant, Bergson, Proust, and a plethora of literary figures. And his style is decidedly perceptual. His biggest influence of all is the flowing, sense-making expressivity of embodied perception. I would also suggest some influence from Impressionist music. There's this subtle unity of divergent harmonizations found in Impressionist music, a kind of coexistence of disparity, divergence, difference within a single gestalt. There's a temporalization of several lines of sense-making. It's almost juggling several melody lines or several rhythms, but temporalizing them in a single gestalt. This is very similar to Merleau-Ponty's idea of the kind of symphony of nature, as a gestalt of all gestalts in which many norms, many sense-making orientations are co-present and evolving together in a single temporalization. This is evident, for example, in Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. Debussy adapted Mallarmé's poem, and in this way he's already showing us how different mediums of expression, aesthetic expression, can come to formulate a sense of life and of the world. Musical composition is already a kind of phenomenological science. It has an expressivity that digs deep into the soul and uses metaphor in order to disclose the depths of the soul. It shows us how intense our soul can feel, how deeply profound its sentiments can be, and how much complexity it can participate with in a non-thetic way. Even Alfred North Whitehead questions whether mathematics or music is a more profound achievement of human consciousness. Phenomenological philosophy is not the extraction of truth, but the actualization of truth. And it comes about through the cultivation of an attitude. It's a way of carrying oneself. It's a style of acting. It's a style of reflecting and describing and actualizing the truth of our being. Merleau-Ponty says that phenomenology is as painstaking as a work of Balzac, Proust, Valéry, and Cézanne, through the same kind of attention and wonder, the same demand for awareness, the same will to grasp the sense of the world or of history in its nascent state. And I would add Debussy, Ravel, Celibidache, Schoenberg, Satie, for whom phenomenology was essential to their inspiration. Impressionism mixes many different stylistic elements that have a lot in common with phenomenology, to say the least. Impressionism involves a lot of subtle complexity. It involves very deep, intense emotions. And one really key element is the idea of modulation. And Merleau-Ponty uses the term modulation metaphorically on many occasions, and this is a really important idea. Impressionism also breaks many conventions, both melodically, tonally, and rhythmically. And in so doing, it's able to institute new norms. It's able to open up new modes of sense-making. I would go so far as to say that many Impressionists are indeed phenomenologists. I'm thinking here of Debussy and Ravel, but along with them we have Kelebidaki, Schoenberg, Satie. Here's a quote from Debussy himself: "I have made mysterious nature my religion. When I gaze at a sunset and spend hours contemplating its marvelous, ever-changing beauty, an extraordinary emotion overwhelms me. Nature, in all its vastness, is truthfully reflected in my sincere, though feeble soul. Around me are the trees stretching up their branches to the skies, and perfumed flowers gladden the meadow, the gentle, grass-carpeted earth, and my hands unconsciously assume an attitude of adoration." Debussy clearly invests his consciousness in deep phenomenological reflection in order to derive his inspiration for musical composition. Let's look a little bit deeper at the prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun. I think that one really important moment in this piece is the whole tone modulations that we hear in this sort of dream trance or swoon that's happening. We move from a familiar tonality into this whole tone scale, which sounds whimsical, and when the main theme plays, we establish a sort of norm that this is the main theme. But when the main theme returns for its second iteration, there's a sort of rhythmic decoupling, and it's as if we're in the presence of two norms, or two gestalts, which, while forming a single temporality together, also continuously sort of diverge from one another and hold each other at a distance, as separate. This is very similar to the multiple layers of meaning in poetry. Plato, for example, is an expert in developing themes on multiple levels of analysis and metaphor. The deepest level is always, for Plato, the desire for a sort of pure phenomenology of the soul, a science that understands the soul directly. What we find also in Plato is this ability to juggle multiple themes at once, weaving multiple narratives together. We find this in Impressionist music as well, and it is central to Merleau-Ponty's philosophical style.